Thank you all for coming today. My name is Ted Johnson. I'm Park Ranger at Seminole Ecological and Historic Preserve. So we've been working quite a bit, as the Park Service has for years actually, with the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor Commission. That's a commission of individuals that are working hard and committed to not only making discoveries about the Gullah Geechee culture and the unique individuals that make that up and the story and history that's involved, but also in helping to preserve that culture and to share it with a larger public, not only as a source of education, but to extend and expand the idea of community, so that these communities themselves can also be a part of a larger and greater community. So appreciation for the uniqueness and the aspects of the culture is something that we're going to work with today with our presentations. I mean, we are really not only surprised, but just ecstatic that we've got so many folks here. Okay. So we have a few presentations by individuals that are either part of Gullah Geechee communities here in the area or somehow help to represent those communities through various organizations. And there are several that exist, organizations, and hopefully more to develop, and opportunities again to share the unique aspects of the Gullah Geechee culture. I do want to talk a little bit more about the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor. It is a national heritage area, and it extends all the way from Pender County near Cape Fear, Wilmington, North Carolina, all the way down to St. Johns County. We say generally St. Augustine, and then over extending to the west to a Gullah Geechee community known as Armstrong. So the Gullah Geechee individuals are basically descendants of those that were individuals that were enslaved, brought from Africa, from the western coast and Central Africa as well, and initially were very skilled with both developing the resources of rice and indigo. Then once they got into this area, there were other crops that developed, including the Sea Island cotton. Now, history I'll allow the others to expound on. But I wanted to say that the uniqueness about the culture is that most of those that are descendants, they're descendants of individuals that were either on some of the sea islands or barrier islands, so a distance normally from the plantations and the plantation owners, who were mostly somewhere on the mainland, or on the coast, on the mainland, but again in areas or locations that were more remote. So the idea was that the proximity, the distance, presented the opportunity for many of these individuals to retain many of their African customs and traditions, as well as assimilating to what they had to deal with here in North America. So the other thing about the corridor is that it not only extends along those states, but it also extends 30 miles inland. So that really gives you what the idea of the locations that are included in the corridor. I'd like to begin with a presentation by Ennis Davis. Again, you learned that he is a planner and a historian. And I've learned quite a bit from him just from working with him in a few months that I've had the pleasure to do so. So we'll turn it on over to Ennis and begin our program. Thank you very much for being here.
All right, so exposing Jacksonville's Gullah Geechee heritage. So the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor is a federal national historic heritage area representing the significant story of the Gullah Geechee people for maintaining their cultural traditions and for being a reflection of the values of ingenuity, pride, and perseverance. The Gullah Geechee are a direct descendant of West Africans that were brought to this country and enslaved throughout the Low Country. While this story is commonly associated with the South Carolina Low Country and coastal Georgia, Northeast Florida is a part of this corridor and is home to the largest concentration of Gullah Geechee people in the country. However, Florida's story is largely unknown. So the institution of slavery in Florida existed long before the U.S. took control of this state. Florida's earliest plantations were established by the Spanish in the 16th century to cultivate rice, sugar, citrus, corn, using Native Americans and West Africans as free labor. Many of those who operated plantations in Florida also operated plantations in South Carolina and Georgia, moving the enslaved back and forth between these properties. Antebellum plat maps of this area identify many of the names of various planters and properties they've received as land grants to establish plantations along the St. Johns River. Through the urban core of Jacksonville, plantations known as Dallas Bluff, Magnolia, Red Bank, Rural Home, and La Villa were lands where West Africans were enslaved to cultivate crops such as cotton, indigo, rice, and naval stores or turpentine. In addition, as early as 1689, enslaved Africans found their way to freedom by escaping south from South Carolina and Georgia to Florida on the Underground Railroad, as opposed to heading north. Here mixing with Native Americans, and as a result, free Gullah and Black Seminole communities were established well south of St. Johns County, leading to the largest enslaved rebellion in the country, also commonly known as the Seminole Wars between 1816 and 1858. This history would pave the way for a massive southward migration of freed enslaved following the Civil War. This Reconstruction era migration to Florida also included my family. Pictured here is my maternal great-grandfather, Dr. Franklin Vereen, who was the son of Jackson and Caroline Vereen of Wampee, South Carolina, who were enslaved on a Walkabout Neck plantation where rice, indigo, and turpentine were produced. Franklin was one of several Gullah Geechee descendants who migrated south during the 1890s for economic opportunity after the devastating fire decimated Horry County's turpentine industry. Specifically in Jacksonville, this migration into Florida meant that by 1870, several freedman communities consisting of former Union soldiers, enslaved Africans, primarily from Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina plantations, in search of lost family members and economic opportunities, established new communities along the St. Johns River and its many tributaries. Being a port city where much of the materials needed to rebuild the South entered, freedmen flocked to the city for jobs in railroad, turpentine processing, maritime, lumber, and manufacturing companies that were clustered here. As a result, a majority Black metropolis emerged, transforming a city that was once smaller than Georgetown, South Carolina in 1860 into the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor's largest by 1920. The density of kinship, heritage, and collaboration led to Jacksonville becoming a major early epicenter in the formative years of vaudeville, ragtime, jazz, and blues, culminating with the Gullah Geechee neighborhood of La Villa being the first location where a documented live performance of the blues took place in this country in 1910. Today, Jacksonville is home to the largest concentration of Gullah Geechee descendants in the country. As a cultural heritage corridor's only major urban center with more than 1 million residents and a number of Reconstruction-era Gullah Geechee communities remain in existence today, it offers an excellent opportunity and environment to share, expose, and promote the history of our ancestors on a greater scale. Examples include Greenland, a small naval storage community dating back to the 1860s that has been preserved, dirt streets and all, due to limited access by being surrounded by a railroad and 2 limited access highways, Interstate 95 and Interstate 295. Or Pine Forest, a Southside community where the enslaved from the nearby Red Bank Plantation settled along the Old Kings Road following emancipation. Another example was Mandarin, now the city's southernmost neighborhood. Did you know that Georgia's McIntosh County's Juliaton Plantation near Sapelo Island was actually not the first? Named after wife Julia, Francis Leavitt's first Julia plantation was established along the St. Johns River in 1767 during Florida's British occupation period. Juliaton, along with other nearby rice and indigo plantations, eventually gave way to the community of Mandarin and East Mandarin, where the former enslaved established new homesteads. While much of Mandarin's rural landscape has given way to modern development, and vestiges of its Gullah Geechee heritage, including Lofton Cemetery, the Maple Leaf National Historic Landmark, Duval County's last standing one-room African-American school from the 19th century, still exists. Today, Mandarin Museum and Historic Society is working to make sure their exhibits are more inclusive to tell their forgotten Gullah Geechee story. Also established in 1866 and 1868, and now recognized as part of downtown Jacksonville, the Gullah Geechee neighborhoods of LaVilla and Brooklyn are both in the midst of rapid gentrification and displacement of the few longtime residents and businesses that still remain. Despite already suffering from significant loss of cultural heritage to urban renewal and gentrification, efforts are underway by a number of groups and individuals to save what's left in order to allow some of the past to live on as a part of the future. This includes a recent effort by Allen Chapel A&M to be recognized as a local historic landmark, providing the congregation, whose many of its members were displaced in recent years, the opportunity to live on amongst surrounding new development. Last but not least, planted in 1869, the East Side developed as a southern terminus of the railroad that connected Jacksonville directly with South Savannah and the South Carolina Low Country. Thus, it became a primary entry point for many of the former enslaved along the barrier islands, the sea islands, seeking a new life away from the isolated plantations they had previously known. Now located near an area where significant new development is planned, several community organizations are working to ensure that the East Side becomes a go-to place for the African American experience in Jacksonville. With its heritage, history, architecture, and cultural identity, the East Side is uniquely positioned to become a destination where one can learn about the Gullah Geechee and the Reconstruction era transition of a rural, isolated culture into an urban setting. While Jacksonville's continued growth has resulted in the loss of certain aspects of the culture, heritage, and tradition, foodways are an important aspect of the culture that has been strengthened through family traditions here, as well as the density that comes with being in a larger city. Dishes featuring foods locally caught, grown, and rationed during slavery, Reconstruction, and the Jim Crow era can be found in many restaurants, fish camps, garlic crab houses, markets, and street corners all over the city today. However, despite being accepted in the mainstream society, many don't know the historical link between these dishes and Jacksonville's Gullah Geechee heritage. This should be viewed as an opportunity to work with the existing social network and businesses to expose our culture heritage in a manner that also promotes preservation while stimulating inclusive economic opportunity and prosperity. In closing, several Gullah Geechee cultural traditions and sites can still be seen and visited today throughout this metropolitan area, 1.5 million residents. These include the city's historic African American churches, cemeteries, the architecture remaining in Gullah Geechee neighborhoods, and traditions such as ties to area waterways and remnants of former plantations and rice fields. That said, I'm going to turn it back over.
Actually,
Any questions? Or?
yeah, because we're gonna need a little time to load up. First of all, I want to say that you don't want to get folks thinking about their lunch already. No, that's great. So folks, while we get the next presentation loaded, do we have questions for Ennis about his presentation or anything else?
Sure.
Not a question, but I just want to, there's several of us here that are on the board of Old Arlington, and we're having our next meeting on Tuesday, February 18th, and we'd like to invite anybody that's interested. Rodney Hurst is coming to do the program that day. He's bringing some of his books and so forth. So if you're interested, I only have a couple of flyers, but if you're interested, it's at the Arlington Women's Club at 6:30 on Tuesday, February 18th.
All right, thank you for sharing that.
What organizations can we support to help preserve Gullah Geechee history here?
So there's several. I think Sandra is going to speak eventually. She's a part of the Gullah Geechee Community Development Corporation. In addition, there's several neighborhood groups such as the East Side Community Development Corporation. I know they're working to kind of limit displacement in their area, so they've actually come pretty organized recently and finding ways to reinvest in their community and limit the amount of displacement of older residents in the community. In addition, there's the Dorothyville Historical Society, which is basically on the west side of downtown. They've been working with the city's Historic Preservation Office, and they've actually part of that neighborhood is now official historic district, which is the first on the National Register in Jacksonville that happens to be African American community.
Thank you.
Yes.
Ennis, have you done any research on St. Nicholas? I noticed Phillips on the map, but that fort that the Spanish established was totally manned by black soldiers. I have heard from that many survivors after the Spanish were gone and families settled in that area. Do you know that story? Have you researched that?
So pretty much in this particular county, every part of land along the St. Johns River was divided and given up into land grants, and the majority of it became various plantations. St. Nicholas was actually a plantation called the Bay of St. Nicholas prior to the Civil War. After the Civil War ended and Jacksonville started to develop, Jacksonville was primarily on the north side of the river. Many of the former enslaved who were part of U.S. colored troops that occupied Jacksonville during the Civil War settled all around the city in the St. Nicholas area. I think Hogan, Spring Park, those were rural former communities all the way up into basic consolidation about 40, 50 years ago that were majority black. And there's a few cemeteries over there. The day I know Zora Neale Hurston, back when she left Eatonville and moved to Jacksonville, her brother's in-laws were basically lived in Spring Park, the Hogan area. She's written a lot about St. Nicholas and that particular area when she was growing up in the first decade or two of the 20th century.
But going back to 1783, when St. Nicholas was established as that barrier between the Protestants and the Catholics, and those soldiers were assigned there, do you have any research about what happened at that century before?
So before 1783, it definitely would have been plantations.
Well, we're talking 1783 when it became the fort until it became.
I don't have any direct information on that fort specifically. My guess would have been around 783. You had a transition back from the British period to Spain, I believe.
It was.
Yeah. So I know there was a lot of transition. It really depended on individuals and who their allegiances to were at that particular time, if they stayed or moved on. So I don't know exactly the details on that particular fort. I just know during that time that was a brief period of transition where even the plantations that were here basically switched over to ownership.
Protestants had to leave. I just thought maybe you knew what happened with those black troops. I had a clue at a conference that they did settle and become part of that St. Nicholas area. So
It's possible. I don't have any direct information on any individual black troops. I just know that when that area transitioned back to Spain, I know there was some movement all over those areas. I don't know if they exactly settled in that particular spot. So I do know that spot became a plantation again at one point.
Prime fodder for continued research. Any other questions?
Yes.
I was just thinking, one of the other things that's interesting is that during the American Revolution, East Florida and West Florida were considered the 14th and 15th colonies. We never hear about them because they never fought on behalf of the Americans. They fought on behalf of the British. But there were many folks who escaped down into Florida, particularly on the east side of the state. And I had never known that until fairly recently. I don't know if other people are aware of that or not. And then over in the Caribbean, those were considered part of the colonies too. So we historically talk about 13, but there were many more than 13 at the time of the Revolution. So we're actually seeing an evolution that goes back even farther.
And I know even with, I know we kind of the Gullah Geechee heritage corridor stretching from Wilmington, North Carolina down to St. Johns County. But I can tell you as a descendant myself, it goes a lot further. I mean, there were, if basically during the Underground Railroad, if you escaped along the plantation and went south, and you got to Florida, you could stay at Fort Mosaic, for example. If you pledged allegiance to the Spanish and you became a Catholic and you agreed to defend St. Augustine's attack. Well, there's another segment of people who escaped that didn't trust the Spanish anymore, they trusted the British. So they kept going south. So there are records of several free black towns, black Seminole communities as far south as Everglades that still retain a lot of their culture and heritage because those are still isolated communities south of us. So there's a lot of history to be uncovered. Yes?
What is the difference between Gullah and Geechee? Is it location?
So Heather may be able to answer that better than I will, but from my understanding, basically Gullah is kind of more associated with South Carolina and Geechee is more associated with coastal Georgia. But Heather.
That's generally true.
Okay.
Yes.
And we also, location, right? So they have the Carolinas, so both north as well, considered Gullah normally, just like that. And then we say on the border there between South Carolina and Georgia is basically that cutoff where you basically are saying Geechee, but there can be variances throughout.
So I think part of Florida's story and struggle in telling that story is both Georgia and South Carolina are always about being considered as a part of those 13 colonies, right? In Florida's history was Spanish for a long time. So there's sometimes just a disconnect in recognizing that Florida has a unique history, but a timeline that's just as long as the rest of the U.S.
Yeah, let me just, so that's why we're here today, and that's why I had Heather Hodges from the director of the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor, is because a lot of the early work that was done to document Gullah Geechee culture and history was done in South Carolina and Georgia, and that record doesn't exist here in Florida. So one of the reasons we are here and excited to support the work of Sandra, who's actually a former commissioner, and Ennis and others is we need to have a better understanding of how the Florida Gullah Geechee experience differs from the rest of the corridor.
Mine was on funding. Is it like through grants or through the National Park Service or that kind of thing? Or is some of this locally? Is it funded like through the city and things?
What exactly?
Well, what you're doing is like trying to preserve those.
So I think when you talk the story of preservation, a lot of times it's not really funded. Now, there are several organizations that are funded with grants and certain things, but in Jacksonville specifically, a lot of it just deals with zoning and policy and city leadership. And many, I think there's a map back there that kind of shows a 1920s zoning map of Jacksonville. A lot of those zoning classifications back during that time were race-based. So a lot of the struggles we deal with in many are economically depressed communities on the north side of town strictly deal with a level of kind of disinterest, uninvestment, disinvestment, and pretty much ignoring certain things that have needed to be done for over a century now. So as a result, you can even look through this city today and they call it the tale of two zip codes. So if you grew up on one side of the street and you didn't have the steel mill and everything next to your house, you might live to be 80, but if you grew up on the other side of the street where the slaughterhouse and everything and contamination was allowed to take place, you'd end up dying at 60. So a lot of that just deals with policy. So I guess my answer is going to be when we talk preservation of heritage of Gullah Geechee culture, or even our Syrian immigrants here, or Chinese immigrants here back in the 19th century. I think a lot of it deals with, it's coming from different sources, but a lot of it does deal with first recognizing that a culture exists, and then looking at what we do today to help preserve what's left.
And part of what the corridor, the commission does is look for opportunities. I mean, there can be new opportunities that develop. There can be, and has been, a newer, invigorated, I'll say, interest now in African American communities, at least to a degree. So that means that even federally, there may be some funding available, but there are prerequisites that are required for funding applications. But sometimes you find that there are periods of time where donors may be more interested in a particular culture, or so you have to look for those opportunities, and this actually could be and seems to be one of those periods. So there are several organizations, even within the National Park Service and the federal government, committees that are being developed to try to be aware, aware of those opportunities, and then network and connect those entities. A great question.
Yes, sir.
Are your presentation slides available online?
I can get them online.
And where would I find them when you get them online?
So if you go to that website there, the jacksonmag.com, I can upload them there.
Gotcha.
And I am recording this, and I will, since I have all the slides, I'm going to combine the slides and the video on the library's YouTube page.
Wow.
So you'll be able to see this in full in
Even easier.
a little while, because I'll come up with something cool.
And folks, we will have more time for questions as well at the end. I want to make sure we do get through the other presentations, but maybe time for one more. I think you have your hand up there.
I can wait till the end.
Yeah. Thanks for all the questions. It's great. Ennis, thank you so much.